Hi, everyone. My name is Krista Averill. I'm the assessment coordinator for the Maine Science Assessment here at Maine DOE. And today we're going to be talking about understanding the Maine Science Assessment and how we can use that understanding to utilize the score reports. But first, the mission and vision of the Maine Department of Education. So the mission and vision is to promote the best learning opportunities for all Maine students by providing information, guidance, and support to our schools, educators, and leaders, and by providing adequate and equitable school funding and resources. And so today, the focus of our time is really on providing that information, guidance, and support. So to understand and read score reports, we first need to understand what the assessment is assessing and how it's structured. So as a result, we're going to begin our discussion today with the assessment blueprint, including the standards that are being assessed, as well as a basic overview of the assessment structure. Later, we'll look at how the standards are used to create achievement level descriptors, which will allow us to determine if a student's performing at state expectations. And then as we progress, we'll discuss reports, statewide results, and some other considerations when you're viewing your students' scores. So first, let's look at standards. The Next Generation Science Standards, or NGSS, were developed by a consortium of states, including Maine, and led by the National Research Council, the National Science Teachers Association, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The Next Generation Science Standards are three-dimensional learning standards that describe a vision of what it means to be proficient in science. They are designed to prepare students for college and career readiness in science, technology, engineering, and math. So although packaged differently, the NGSS are the science content standards included in the Maine learning results. So after reviewing the NGSS, we will take a moment to look at how the presentation or packaging of the standards is different in the Maine learning results. So the NGSS are organized around three dimensions: the science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and the disciplinary core ideas. So let's look here for a moment at why does the structure of the NGSS matter? You came here today to talk about score reports, so why are we looking at the standards first? So I want to give you some examples of three-dimensional items or questions from the Maine Science Assessment so you can see how all of this is going to be pulled together. So this first example is from the grade 5 science assessment. This is no longer an operational item, it's a released item. And of course, there were many contextual pieces of information given before this question was given to the students. But you can see here that it is aligned to a DCI, a disciplinary core idea, a science and engineering practice, and a cross-cutting concept. When we look at this example from grade 8, again, we can see the same thing. And then also from high school. And so just keeping in mind that these three core components of the NGSS are very purposefully integrated throughout the assessment. So it's really important that we have an understanding of what they are. So I just want to highlight this quote from the Framework for K-12 Science Education. The actual doing of science or engineering can pique students' curiosity, capture their interest, and motivate their continued study. So one of the things that the NGSS really does well is looks at science as more than just a collection of facts and really looking at how students do science as a discipline. And so in order to look at this, this is really the focus of the science and engineering practices. You'll notice that throughout the presentation, I often reference a framework for K-12 science education. I highly recommend it as a resource for your educator PLCs to look at to really highlight each of these three dimensions we'll be looking at. So, science and engineering practices, or SEPs, describe behaviors that scientists engage in as they investigate and build models and theories about the natural world. There are 8 science and engineering practices. 7 of them are utilized in the creation of the Maine Science Assessment, and those would be asking questions and defining problems, developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, using mathematics and computational thinking, constructing explanations and designing solutions, and engaging in argument from evidence. So we're going to look at the 3 spheres of activity for scientists and engineers and how these pull together the SEPs and how it connects directly to our grouping of the SEPs on the Maine Science Assessment. So in this first sphere, our activities related to empirical investigation. So scientists determine what needs to be measured. They observe phenomena, plan experiments and methods of data collection, and identify sources of uncertainty. The activities related to developing explanations and solutions are shown here on the right. So for scientists, this includes drawing from established theories and models and proposing new models or perhaps extensions to those theories. And often scientists develop a model or hypothesis that leads to new questions to investigate. So between these 2 spheres of activity is the practice of evaluation. So this is an iterative process, requires critical thinking, and it can include developing and refining an idea or conducting an investigation. This sphere really focuses on argumentation and critique, which can lead then to further experiments and observations or changes in theories and models. So we use SEP groupings in the design of the Maine Science Assessment, which you'll see in more detail in our blueprints. But just to highlight that we have a grouping called Investigate, which is asking questions and planning and carrying out investigations. Evaluating, which includes that analyzing and interpreting data, using mathematics and computational thinking, and engaging in argument from evidence, as well as reasoning scientifically or developing and using models and constructing explanations. So a framework for K-12 science education is really an excellent resource, again, for your educator PLCs in really exploring these topics. So some resources that you can find in there, just to highlight what they are definitions of how these SEPs are expressed in science and in engineering and how that's similar and different. You'll also find in the framework goals for the SEPs by grade 12, as well as a progression of how to get there. So excellent resource. Cross-cutting concepts describe the concepts that apply across all scientific disciplines and help students make connections between different areas of science. The cross-cutting concepts that are pulled into the Maine Science Assessment are patterns, cause and effect, scale, proportion, and quantity, systems and system models, energy and matter, structure and function, and stability and change. So again, highlighting a quote from the framework that these concepts should become common and familiar touchstones across the disciplines and grade levels. Explicit reference to the concepts can help students develop a cumulative, coherent, and usable understanding of science and engineering. And one of the really nice things about the cross-cutting concepts, and we'll see this later when we look at the NGSS site, is this really allows you to make effective interdisciplinary connections in your instruction. The framework does offer some resources for cross-cutting concepts, including in detail descriptions of each of those CCCs, and again, as well as that progression from early elementary school through the end of high school. And our last of the 3 dimensions are the disciplinary core ideas, or DCIs. So these describe the core ideas in each scientific discipline, physical science, life science, and earth science, that students should know and understand by the end of high school. So these are science topics that have broad importance across multiple science disciplines, provide a key tool for understanding or investigating complex ideas and solving problems, relate to students' interests and life experiences or societal concerns, are teachable and learnable over multiple grades. And it's not intended to be an exhaustive list of science and engineering learning. Instead, it's really an expression of those key concepts that all citizens should be familiar with. And so here you can see the core and component ideas in physical sciences. In life sciences, and in the earth and space sciences. The framework offers some good supports for this. So the first would be a central question of focus for each core and component idea, and grade band endpoints. So goals for the end of grade 2, by the end of grade 5, by the end of grade 8, and by the end of grade 12. So performance expectations are going to combine these 3 dimensions into statements about what students should know and be able to do by the end of instruction. Each performance expectation does include a disciplinary core idea, a science and engineering practice, and a cross-cutting concept. So let's take a moment to look at what these look like within the context of the Maine learning results. So we know the next generation science standards are quote unquote packaged differently. Let's look at the packaging here first, and then we'll look back at the NGSS. I'm sure you're very familiar with this site. But if not, here are where you can locate those Maine learning results. Each of these documents right here is a Word doc. I'm not going to click on it and open it up because there aren't many links in the Word doc to go to from there. So I will come back over here and highlight for you what it looks like. So one of the things that I want to point out before we even look at the first example is our 3 dimensions of the next generation science standards are going to be highlighted in this document. You will see the SEPs in blue, the disciplinary core ideas in orange, and the cross-cutting concepts in green. We're going to look at this 5th grade standard 5-LS1-1 for both what it looks like in the MLRs, so the Maine learning results, and the NGSS. And so this is supporting an argument that plants get the materials they need for growth chiefly from air and water. Here you can see our SEPs engaging an argument from evidence. Our DCI, or disciplinary core idea, is organization for matter and energy flow in organisms, and our cross-cutting concept is energy and matter. One of the things that will appear in the Maine learning results only and not on the next generation science standards page are connections to Maine. So you can see this across all examples on this screen, but for this standard, possible Maine connections include frogs and vernal tools, Atlantic salmon life cycle, and both of these refer to Maine plants and animals. So that is one feature that will appear only in the Maine learning results document rather than the NGSS. We are going to take a look at the same standard on the NGSS site. So in your copy of the slides, the link at the top will take you generically to nextgenscience.org, but we are going to go straight to this standard. And so this is going to offer you a few more resources and be a little bit more interactive than the Word document that you'll find on the Maine DOE site. So first I want to highlight that if an educator is scrolling over the parts of this performance expectation, they will see highlighted for them which parts of the statement relate to the SEP, to the DCI, to the CCC, and then back to the DCI. So it really highlights where all of these different components are coming together to create this performance expectation. You can also see down here that these are spelled out for you. So it's not just saying energy and matter, but it's giving you a little bit more information. One of the things that I really like about accessing the standards from this view are some of the other supports that are included here below and then also to the right. So if I look at connections to DCIs in 5th grade, I can come over here to matter and its interactions. So I was previously looking at planning an investigation to see if plants need air and water. And then if I look over here, then I can have my students perhaps integrate that with developing a model to show that matter is made of particles too small to be seen. So water particles and air particles could be drawn in. So a great connection there. Something else that I really, really like is that it has the articulation of DCIs across grade levels. So instead of just being generic life science DCIs, I can see exactly the last time students were talking specifically about plants. So if I look back at this grade 2 standard, they were conducting an investigation. Here they're supporting an argument. And when you move on to the middle school standard, that one is about photosynthesis. So it really shows you that progression for this very specific topic. It also has references to Common Core state standards in ELA literacy and math, including your mathematical practices. So a great way, again, to make those interdisciplinary connections. If your teachers need support with understanding what this looks like in terms of student performance, the NGSS has links to evidence statements that they can look at to really help them understand what does it look like when a student knows how to meet the standard. And last but not least, there are links to exemplar units. So, for example, the resources for this particular unit about food, from sun to food. So a lot of great resources for your teachers and a lot of things for them to potentially look at in their PLC groups. Again, highly recommend it. So the Maine Science Assessment contains questions that together are going to assess all 3 dimensions to measure student understanding of the Maine learning results and the NGSS. We are going to take a look now at the blueprints. So the Maine Science Assessment has blueprints and specifications for each grade level. Blueprints specify targets for the minimum and maximum number of operational score points aligned to each science discipline or topic. All items are aligned to a specific NGSS performance expectation. And the blueprints allowed for a really purposeful yet fluid incorporation of those disciplinary core ideas in science and engineering practices. We'll see in a moment that there are targets for each of those, how many should appear on the assessment. There's no specific targets for the inclusion of cross-cutting concepts, but they certainly are included. And any science and engineering practice and cross-cutting concept may be assessed with any DCI. So that's the fluid nature of the assessment creation. I do want to highlight here that the assessment is designed to ensure that it measures the Maine learning results, or the NGSS, in a comprehensive and balanced way across multiple years. So not every DCI is measured on the assessment every year. And we'll talk more about appropriate uses of data in a bit, but I just want to highlight that here for you as well. So let's take a moment to look at one of these blueprints. We'll look at grade 5. So as I was saying, it sets very specific targets for what percentage of items will address each of these performance expectations. So grade 5 is organized into each of these topics, which each have their own subscore. And then each topic is comprised of performance expectations and has a target percentage. There are also target percentages for the coverage of science and engineering practices. So at least 90% of the items on the assessment should be aligned to an SEP. There may be some items that do not measure an SEP are aligned just to a DCI, or perhaps a DCI and a CCC. but at least 90% need to be aligned to an SEP. The last page of your blueprint will just give you a little bit of information about the time of the assessment, number of operational items, field test items, and total. As a note, if you are currently accessing the high school science blueprint, we do need to still update the change in the time. Grade 5 and grade 8 are 60 minutes per session. Grade high school will be 50 minutes per session starting this spring. So one of the questions that we frequently get is, where do the questions on the assessment come from? So the New Meridian Science Exchange is a licensable collection of science items contributed by states from their NGSS aligned assessments, as well as items specially developed by New Meridian. All items selected for use on the Maine Science Assessment are thoroughly reviewed by New Meridian's science specialist, as well as their accessibility, accommodations, and fairness specialist, as well as by the Maine Department of Education and educators prior to use in Maine. So just because an item exists within the Science Exchange Bank does not mean that it's automatically approved for use in Maine. We do review it during forms review as well. There are a lot of different item types. So the first is selected response. The Maine Science Assessment includes both your traditional multiple select and multiple choice items. Multiple choice is choosing one, multiple select is choosing more than one. Multiple choice items are typically worth 1 point. Multiple select can be worth 1 or 2 points, depending on the question. We also have technology enhanced items on the Maine Science Assessment that includes primarily drag and drop items, like the one you see on your screen here. Hotspots. So hotspots are when students answer by selecting an area of an image. They might be clicking on regions of a map or parts of a diagram. And then there's inline choice. So that's when students are selecting from a drop-down list, typically within a sentence. And technology items can be worth 1 or 2 points. And we also have constructed response items on the Maine Science Assessment. So these are items that ask students to provide a brief written explanation in response to a prompt. And these items are developed with a rubric that specifies the requirements for full and partial credit, and they are scored by trained human readers. Constructed response questions are not always, but often found at the end of a cluster of questions, which build in complexity to get to that question type. So all questions on the Maine Science Assessment are going to ask students to make sense of a phenomenon or an observable occurrence in the natural human-made world that can cause one to wonder and ask questions, or to make sense of a scientific problem. We have item clusters and standalone items. So most items are grouped in a set or cluster. That's pretty much the standard for the majority of the assessment. And these clusters are designed to provide scaffolding and sufficient information to measure multiple dimensions of the science standards without teaching the content. So we want to be able to present a phenomenon, have students interact with that phenomenon, provide even sometimes data that goes along with sample experiments the characters in the phenomenon may have conducted, but we don't want to teach them the content. That's not the purpose of the assessment. And across each cluster, all 3 dimensions are addressed. There are also standalone items. So this would be a brief scenario with just 1 question. Standalone items help ensure that we have appropriate coverage of the main learning results to the NGSS according to the blueprints. So they help us fill in any gaps that may occur. We are going to look at some examples of item clusters and standalone items. So on our website, the Maine Science Assessment website, for when you're looking for these later, under content is where you can find our blueprints, achievement level descriptors, and our released items. We have copies that are for students. So that's a copy without the answers, just the question. And then we have copies for teachers, which include the item and the answers. This is one of our earlier released item documents. The other ones are formatted more similarly to the actual paper-based booklet. But here you can see, so we have a stimulus here that's described in depth. It has a diagram. It has some additional table down here with solution and image. And then it has a series of questions. So that build as we look again at the stimulus. So on the computer-based version, students would still see the stimulus on the left. And then when they clicked the next button to go to the next question, the stimulus would remain and the new question appears. And so as the students are going through these questions, it's gradually building in complexity. Often the question can be addressed by integrating the knowledge of the previous questions that they've answered. The questions are in the order they're in for a very specific reason to build that complexity as they go through. And this particular item cluster does end with a constructed response question that helps the student to integrate everything from across the cluster. Your exemplars or released items will also have rubrics. And then this is an example of a standalone item. So it's a short description. This case has an example of Keaton's poster, and then it's just one question associated with that. So still presenting a phenomenon or a problem and still having the student look at it, but shorter and briefer in scope. All right, so we are going to talk about achievement levels. We have 4 achievement levels that we report to for the Maine Science Assessment. We're going to look at those. We're going to look a little bit about achievement level descriptors. And then because the question always arises about, well, where did these achievement level cut scores come from? We'll talk a little bit about standard setting. So there are 4 achievement levels for the Maine Science Assessment that describe student mastery of the Maine learning results. So you can see here for well below state expectations, we're looking at a minimal understanding of essential concepts. Students' responses are demonstrating minimal ability to solve problems, and those explanations might be incomplete or missing connections amongst their central ideas. When we go up to below state expectations, we've moved from a minimal understanding to an incomplete understanding and some inconsistent connections between central ideas. But the students' responses are demonstrating some ability to analyze and solve problems, although they may be incomplete or unclear. At the state expectations level, we're moving up again. So we're looking at an adequate understanding of essential concepts in science. We're making connections among central ideas, and the students' responses are really showing that they have the ability to analyze and solve routine problems and explain central concepts. And once we get to the above state expectations level, now we're looking at a thorough understanding of essential concepts in science, making multiple connections amongst central ideas, and the student is able to synthesize information, analyze and solve difficult problems, and explain complex concepts using evidence and the appropriate terminology. So we are going to watch 2 brief parts of this video. So one piece at the end in which Sherry, who's from the New Meridian science content team, is going to talk a little bit about achievement level descriptors as an introduction, and then we'll skip ahead to where she's going to give you some examples.
My name is Sherry Newland, and I am the Test Development Manager for Science at New Meridian Corporation, the company that produced the Maine Science Assessment. Today, I'm going to be walking you through some documentation of achievement level descriptors, otherwise known as ALDs, to aid in your understanding of their development, as well as how they can be used. So what are ALDs? The Achievement Level Descriptors document is intended to be used as a guideline to describe the 4 levels of achievement or levels of student mastery of the standards of instruction, science, and engineering that have been identified by the Maine Department of Education. This document is made to support the effective teaching and assessment of Maine K-12 science and engineering instructional programs, as well as to guide the standard setting process for the Maine Science Assessment, which will be done by Maine educators along with New Meridian staff in July of 2022. The ALDs are written to align with the next generation science standards topics Maine adopted the next generation science standards as their science standards. The NGSS topics are standards that are grouped to show the natural connections between the disciplinary core ideas, otherwise known as DCIs. To support the intent of the standards for science instruction and assessment in Maine, all science and engineering practices, also known as SEPs, and cross-cutting concepts, also known as CCCs, can be used interchangeably with any of the DCIs, not just the ones found in the performance expectations, or PEs. It's the intent that the SEP and CCC are selected to enhance the application of the DCIs to make sense of a phenomenon presented in the scenario. This is an example ALD table showing the progression of a DCI. The DCI alone is not what determines the achievement level. Rather, it is the combination of all three dimensions. So, for the exemplar DCI, all other achievement levels could be possible if combined with different SEPs and/or different CCCs. These documents just give the 4 exemplars per NGSS topic rather than following through each and every DCI for all 4 achievement levels, as that would lead to hundreds of pages. You can see here that the DCI is PS1A, Structure and Properties of Matter. So a student that would get a question right that we would consider to be well below state expectations, for that DCI, if we combine it with the SEP of SEP4, evaluate, represent data to reveal patterns that indicate that materials can be identified based on their properties and those properties are suitable for different purposes. That particular combination of SEP, CCC, and DCI leads to a task that a student at the well below state expectations could get right on the Maine Science Assessment. If we took that same DCI, PS1A, that materials can be identified based on their properties, and those properties are suitable for different purposes, and we combined that with a different SEP, such as use evidence to support an explanation, that increases the cognitive load on the student and could bump them up to being something that a student at below state expectations would get right on the Maine Science Assessment. So that might look like use evidence to support an explanation that materials can be identified based on their properties, and those properties are suitable for different purposes. Now, to go further up the achievement level scale to a student that would be performing at state expectations, a task on the Maine Science Assessment may look something more like plan an investigation to show that materials can be identified based on their properties, and those properties are suitable for different purposes. And then once again, crossing the threshold into the student that is performing above state expectations, a task at that level may include something like supporting an argument that materials can be identified based on their properties, and those properties are suitable for different purposes.
So let's take a moment to look at one of those ALD documents that Sherry was describing. So as Sherry said, it would not be possible to outline all of these options, fill in all of these gray boxes to show how each of these DCIs can be represented with all of the different SEPs and all of the different cross-cutting concepts. It's already 13 pages, that would make it hundreds of pages. So these documents are really just going to give you 4 exemplars for each of the DCIs. So here you can see examples of what a student would be able to do at the well below state expectations level, what that student might be able to do at the below state expectations level, at state expectations, and above state expectations. And so there's a progression of tasks or skills or understandings that align with a student performing at each of those achievement levels. And they are represented across the DCIs. So standard setting is when these achievement levels are associated with cut scores that then apply to the assessment and future iterations of the assessment. So standard setting for the Maine Science Assessment took place in summer of 22. It was facilitated by New Meridian, the science assessment vendor. It was monitored by some psychometricians that were not New Meridian employees. And the panelists that participated in the essential core work of standard setting were all Maine educators. There are many different standard setting methods. If you've been with me before to talk about standard setting for our state reading and math assessment, that was an extremely different process. So the process used for the Maine Science Assessment, to be briefly described here, was the ordered item booklet method. So essentially, after the field test, items were listed in order of item difficulty or the probability of a student answering the question correctly. Then educators looked at these achievement level descriptors that had been provided. In some cases, they made some little edits to finesse them. And then they created student profiles for students who would perform at each achievement level. So what do those skills look like in the classroom? What is the student doing? So there was quite a bit of discussion about how do these students look different in their performance within the classroom. Then educators bookmarked the location in the ordered item booklet where a student from a specific achievement level would have a 2/3 chance of answering the question correctly. So for this particular model of standard setting, they're actually looking at a booklet that contains the science items from that first operational test. So those field test items that became operational. The educators have the option after independently bookmarking the location in the ordered item test booklet to discuss. And then if they want to change their bookmarking, they can, or they can maintain the bookmarking following the discussion. So that's the standard setting method that's used for the Maine Science Assessment. And then there's a scaling that happens and an equating that carries over those cut scores from year to year. So let's look at reports and reporting elements. First, I want to talk a little bit about appropriate uses and limitations of data. So Maine Science Assessment data has several appropriate uses as a state assessment. That includes providing information to the public about school performance through the state's ESSA reporting system. So that's the ESSA data dashboard. And supporting school identification within the state's ESSA compliant system of school identification and support. That is a potential use of state assessment data. And providing a source of information for ongoing local program evaluation. But there also are some limitations to the data gathered from the assessment. To be clear, there are limitations to data gathered from every assessment. But these are the ones that we'll focus on for Maine Science. So one limitation is that the assessment measures only a subset of the Maine learning results and does not assess all aspects of science education. We had discussed that one previously. The assessment is a snapshot of student performance at a particular point in time. It may not reflect a student's overall understanding of science. That's just as true for other state assessments, being a snapshot at a particular point in time. And it's only one measure of student performance and should be used in conjunction with other measures such as classroom assessments and teacher observations. So of course, we always talk here at Maine DOE on the assessment team about triangulating your data and looking at multiple sources of data. So when you're using this data gathered from the Maine Science Assessment, we just want to ensure that you're using it appropriately while also considering its limitations when you're making decisions about instructional support and improvement. So let's walk ourselves through these reports and highlight some of those reporting elements at the same time. So this is the individual student report. The individual student report is required to be sent home to families. We don't have a particular timeline for that, but if you haven't done it yet, I highly recommend doing it soon, given that we are in November. On the first page of the individual student report is really information for parents to help them understand what's in the report. So for example, answering these two questions. What is in this report? What is the Maine Science Assessment? And then we have our little Surgeon General's warning right here that emphasizes that to create a more complete understanding of what your student knows and can do in relation to grade level standards, information from this report should be used alongside additional sources. That is also included on our ISR for the Maine 3-year assessment. There's also a section for parents at the bottom of the first page to really help them facilitate those discussions with their student as well as with their student's teacher. Page 2 of the ISR is where we get into the score information. So the scale score here. So scaling is a process that we use to convert raw scores, so the actual number of questions correct or the actual number of score points received, because we have to consider 2-point questions, into a common scale that can be used to compare student performance across different forms of the assessment. So for example, we have an accommodated paper-based form and an online form, and across different years. So we report our scale scores as integers, and they are used to determine a student's achievement level. So when we're looking at our 2024 achievement level alignments, that table right there will show you the cut scores. You'll notice that the bands for well below state expectations and above state expectations are wider. If you think about that kind of like a bell curve and how you can have students really at those extremes, but there's fewer and fewer students there, think about that the same way here. We have these extremes all the way to 80 and all the way down to 1, but there's very few students that are all the way at those extremes. However, we do need to still make sure we have enough room there for them to have a score. So hence the extra wide, well below state expectations and above state expectations bands. There's also scale score comparisons. So we're looking at average school SAU and state scores. And that would be the mean. And we have the standard error of measurement. So there's a note here that a student's test score can vary. And if your student took this test again, it's likely that they would score between 31 and 35 points. This is just looking at SEM, or standard error of measurement. And that's a measure that quantifies the amount of error in a student's score on an assessment. So all standardized assessments have standard error of measurement associated with their scores. Whether or not they're clearly reported right in front of you is another thing, but they do all have them. So this really estimates how much a student's score might differ if they took the assessment multiple times. And it provides some information about the precision of the assessment scores that helps determine the confidence that can be placed in a student's score. If the SEM is nice and small, the student score is more precise and less likely to vary across repeated administrations of the assessment. And if the SEM is large, that means the student score is less precise and more likely to vary. So when we're looking at the ISRs for Maine Science, it uses a 68% confidence interval, or just plus or minus 1 SEM. So we have what is the best estimate of the student's ability, which here would be a score of 33. And then we have plus or minus the standard error of measurement, which in this case would be 2. The standard error of measurement would be 2 points. So if I add 2 to 33, I get 35, subtract 2, I get 31. And therefore the best estimate of their ability level, if they took it again, would be likely between 31 and 35 points. We also have our subscores on the ISRs. So you'll notice them at the bottom. Grade 5 does have different subscore topic areas than grades 8 and high school. So grade 5 will be structure and properties of matter, matter and energy in organisms and ecosystems, earth systems and space systems. And grades 8 in high school have physical science, life science, and earth and space science. You can see on the blueprints which standards are aligned to each of these subscore areas. I'll also just briefly put each of them on the screen for you here. Now grade 8. And again, if you look in the blueprints for grades 8 in the high school, it will write out for you which performance expectations are aligned. So these are the DCIs listed. So let's look at the next level of report, which would be the school summary report. So when we're looking at our reporting elements, the section that's marked with a 1, those are your score comparisons. So again, you're looking at average for school, SAU, and state. So if you're looking for state level data, it is contained within both your school and SAU reports. You have your achievement level pie charts there. Just one nice way of looking at that information. And then you have your aggregate performance of all students in the school, inclusive of all grades. So that's the last pie chart to the right. Will be all of the grades together. There's a table that's going to show your aggregate data for all students in the school. That's inclusive of all grade levels. There is a second page to this report that will break this down. You have your total number of students tested, represented by total N tested. And you have one of my favorite measures that's available for this assessment. It's your percent borderline students. So that's the percent of students from the total population, so from all of your kids, that appear in the below state expectations achievement level, but their standard error of measurement indicates that their actual score may have fallen in the at state expectations level. Now, this is a fake report, right? This is not real. So this percent borderline likely should have been 9, because that would represent that all 9% of our students, 9% of the total population, 9% of the total population, were actually close enough to at that if they were tested again, they may be at the very lower end of the at state expectations level. It's helpful when you're considering your student performance as a whole. Some schools or SAUs may notice that this percent of borderline students is actually fairly high. And that will give you some context that when you're thinking about how many students are at and above versus well below and below. And it also gives you the student count and percentage at each achievement level. There's a second page to the school report that breaks it down for you a bit more. We are only looking at one grade level table, but in an actual school report, it would give you as many grades that are assessed as you have in the school. So if you have a middle school with both grade 5 and 8, they're both going to appear. So we have in the one grade level table, the information for the school at that grade level, information for the state at that grade level. So again, a good place to find this information. Average scaled score. So you have that for both the school and the state. Your percent borderline students. And that's again, the percent out of the total student population. And your average subscores. So just a reminder here that the subscore areas are different for grade 5 than for grade 8 in high school. That's why they're indicated here as subscore 1, subscore 2, and subscore 3. So when you're looking at your score interpretation guide, or when you're looking back at these slides, that's where it will designate for you which one's subscore 1, which one's subscore 2, and which one's subscore 3. Or in a moment, we'll look at the student score data file, and it is listed in that file what they each are. The SAU summary report is very, very similar to the school report. We're just moving up an organizational level. So we still have our score comparisons, this time just SAU and state. We have our achievement level pie charts, our SAU aggregate pie chart with all grades, and we have our table with aggregate data. Our total number of students tested, our percent borderline students, they're in the table, and our student count and percentage at each achievement level. It's basically the same report, but now we're looking at the SAU level. On the second page of the SAU report, and perhaps third page, depending on how large your SAU is, that's where it starts to break it down. So this is, again, just one grade level table. There'd be a separate one for grade 8 and high school. And so you'll see information for each school, information for the SAU, so all of that information combined, Again, I will note that this is fake data, so if those numbers don't seem to be adding up to you, it's because they don't. Information for the state at one grade level, average scaled score for the row, and average achievement level for the students at that grade level. And of course, their average subscores. So subscores are raw scores, just as a note. So the student score data file is one of my most highly recommended resources. So when you download it, it is going to be a CSV file just for us to be able to navigate this a little bit better. I am going to format it as a table. So this is a sample district with 23 students, 6 schools, all 3 grade levels. And if I look over here, so of course I've removed any identifying student information. But what you'll have here is the student scale score. It does give you the minimum points on the test. So I will note that although on the ISR we put 1 as the minimum, depending on the version of the assessment, sometimes the minimum is more than 1. You would see that here. The maximum points on the test, your achievement level for that student, whether or not they met that borderline student criteria. And then you'll also see here each of their subscores, student raw scores, and max points. So let's say I want to filter here. Let's just do grade 8. So this is nice because you can also do some very simple calculations here to look at not only how many students are at each achievement level, which you could get from their ISRs, though that would be very time consuming to put together, but you can also calculate some mean subscores for a group of students and have that help you identify perhaps which of those disciplines or which of those topics for grade 5 that your students need some more support in. So this has a little bit more information closer together. So a good resource for that. So those would be your primary report types that are available in Kite. So you have 3 PDFs that provide you with a pretty good graphical display. And then you have your student score data file where you can really kind of dig into that information more. So one of the things that I would recommend perhaps for your educator PLCs is, of course, filtering out, let's say you have a group of grade 8 teachers. They don't necessarily need to see the grade 5 data unless they're working, in vertical PLC groups. But making sure your educators can see the data that they need and then perhaps providing those PLCs with the spreadsheet itself so that they have a little bit more information than if you were just to provide them with the PDFs, the ISRs. There's always been a request for statewide results. Now, most of these results are in your reports already, so I am not going to focus too long on these, but they are here. We did have 35,973 students complete the assessment in spring 24 with about 12,000 at each grade level. These are all grade levels aggregated. So in the slides, you'll be able to access that as well as your statewide data for each grade. I did also provide your state average raw scores and the state percent at or above state expectations for each of the subscore areas for you for all 3 grade levels assessed. And these are helpful to perhaps to have you look at not only how you performed, but also perhaps there's areas statewide that are a little bit different. So at high school, it may be that because we assess in 3rd year of high school, more students have had experience with the life science topics than they have with physical science at that point in their education. So here's just a visual representation of our statewide achievement data across all 3 grades that are assessed, and then an aggregate on the right-hand side. So one consideration when you're looking at your student scores and one consideration coming up to the next administration in the Maine Science Assessment is text-to-speech. So text-to-speech is a designated support for the general assessments, Maine Science and Maine Through Year. And the criteria for the assignment of text to speech is that a team of 2 or more education professionals with knowledge of the student's performance have determined that text to speech is an appropriate support, and text to speech or read aloud, because I understand that there are situations in which you're doing paper based assessments or things like that. Text to speech or read aloud is routinely used in classroom instruction and assessment. I do want to highlight here that designated supports such as text to speech do not require that a student has an IEP, a 504 plan, an ILAP, which is an individual language acquisition plan, an RTI plan, or any other support plan. In order to meet those two criteria does not require the presence of a support plan. Sometimes people need a little bit of help with this first criterion. So determining that text to speech is an appropriate support for the student. And that's why we released supplemental guidance last spring before the spring 24 administration around this. Students should be able to navigate the assessment independently and with confidence to the greatest degree possible. Students should be able to read the assessment independently to the greatest degree possible because it's a science assessment and we want to ensure that we are assessing the construct of science and not the construct of reading. So if educators perceive that a student would struggle to decode 2 or more words from a grade level list, text to speech is an appropriate designated support for that student. And at the link in the slides will take you to the complete supplemental guidance document. But on these slides, I'm also going to display for you the science lists that have been created for grades 5, 8, and high school. These lists do not mean that all of these words are included in every assessment. That's certainly not the case. But every single one of these words has the potential to be included in that grade level assessment, and they are tied to the standards for that grade level. So if students are not able to read these lists of academic specific vocabulary, they likely should be assigned text to speech. And if they are assigned text to speech, they should be provided the opportunity to interact with that tool via a practice test or a tutorial before the day of the assessment administration. The last little bit to talk about is constructed response items. So these are just some statistics to think about when you're thinking about your students' scores. So we had in spring 24 a few different constructed response items, which are noted here as CR for constructed response. And this just gives you an overview of how students performed on those. The reason I wanted to highlight this is because one of the things that we ask for from our vendor is a breakdown of that 0 score point. And they're able to provide me with what percent of the total student population that participated in the assessment left the constructed item response box blank, put nothing at all. And then how many put something that was unreadable, like a key run, ASDF, or something like that. And so the percent blank out of the total student population is shown here. And you can see for one of the grade 8 items, it was at 3%. For the only high school constructed response item from last spring, 4% or 1 out of every 25 kids left that item completely blank and did not attempt to answer it. So just something to consider. For unreadable, those percentages were between about 0.5% to just under 2%, depending on the item, but it was usually 0.5 to about 1%. And the last thing I have for you is comparing assessment models, just so you have an understanding of how these things are related to one another. This is a document that was developed with a group of educators and administrators who were working with me on ISRs for the through-year assessment. And we were really looking at how are these assessments similar and different. So we were looking at Maine through year in the fall, winter, and spring, then Maine through year just in the spring, and the Maine Science Assessment, and highlighting some of the ways that they're the same and some of the ways that they are different. So just another resource for you, because the format of an assessment is related to the results that come from it. So this can help you in making sense of your science assessment results, perhaps in comparison to your reading and math results.